When we call something out, what we usually try to say is that we have absolutely no idea what we are talking about. But at the same time, we want to be particularly smug at this specific moment of time. But what do we really mean when we call something out? Can we even define what is and what is not out? And if so, what would such a definition be? And could we apply it to something like Outer Wilds? Let's try to find it out. Trying to figure out what is and what is not out has been a hobby of ours for almost as long as our obsession with viciously killing each other for absolutely no reason. So if we want to know if we can call something a piece of out, we firstly need to jump back into the horrendous, despicable times when Starbucks and food delivery haven't been invented yet. And we need to do that to talk about our favorite prehistoric boomer, Praetor. You see, Praetor had his own idea for what is out and why we appreciate it in the first place. For him, our physical world was inferior by default. That's because he believed in another, separate from ours, plane of existence. The one which is not concerned with physical shapes, but where things exist in their purest forms. The forms of ideas. Everything we see and interact with in our world is nothing more than shadows cast by those ideas. Despite giving us a hint about how those uncontained forms may look like, our world is doomed to forever be a lesser reality which could never show us the true beauty of things. Long story short, Praetor thinks, or rather thought, that we live in a matrix, but instead of reality behind it being an abhorrent hellscape of doom and despair, it is exactly like the simulated world, only like a million times better. But what does all of this mean for out? Well, if all we see is nothing more than a pale, inferior imitation, then the out we create is just another copy of what is already a copy. Praetor viewed out as our attempts to imitate something perfect. But because we can't even see that perfection in the first place, our attempts would forever be fruitless. This means that Outer Wilds is just our attempt to imitate the objective reality where we are a three-eyed sentient creature stuck in a tiny universe where the sun continues to explode, but each time we end up waking up unscattered minutes before it goes up in flames again. Yes, that makes absolutely no sense. So let's try something more close to our enlightened and advanced age of reason. Let's try some Kant, but spelled with a K and not C. In Kantism, art is all about the individual expression of an author. It is not something one can be taught or teach it to someone else. It is rather something that comes from within and not just from the observation and imitation of the world around. However, at the same time, the Church of Kant preaches that art is very dependent on some intrinsic, objective set of rules that every real artist should follow in order for their creation to be considered beautiful. Yes, it kind of clashes with the self-expression part of this definition, but Big Daddy Kant justified it by calling people who can create true high-class art geniuses who have been blessed by nature with the gift to follow its existing rules without even realizing it. And here we can start noticing a certain pattern in how we can judge the artistic integrity of things. Both Plato and Kant, who are objectively the only two philosophers that ever lived, referred to some outside principles that should be followed if one wants to create anything artistic. So, in order to either create or criticize art, we need to understand what exactly are those underlying guidelines that dictate the quality of art are. And it is not only us here who came up with such revolutionary and mind-breaking conclusions all by ourselves and with absolutely no external help. This desire to understand the underlying mechanisms behind the artistic processes is what created the formalistic approach to art and literature, but literature is also a part of art because art is a general, all-encompassing term, so I don't know why I specified that. But besides me being redundant, the formalist tried to establish patterns that govern every single form of art. From the tiniest sounds that make musical composition pleasant to our monkey brains, to how certain colors of paintings make our still monkey brains feel excited or sad. Because those fine gentlemen believed that art is like craftsmanship, It is not something which is given to you from birth, but rather a thing that should be analyzed, broken into its most basic components, and then examined under the magnifying glass of logic and reason. So if we'd like to look at the Outer Wilds from the formalist point of view, then we would be looking at its engine, its structure and music layering, the intentional choice of dialogue branches, and things like the general organization of all event triggers in this game. And although it is a very legitimate way of describing and understanding art, there is one slight problem with such an approach. It is very boring. And maybe it is my low attention keeping always restless chicken brain who is responsible for me being unable to look at art from a formalistic stance, but to my defense I can at least say I'm not completely alone in this, because formalist people had a pretty good run with their theory. It was pretty popular and produced quite a lot of very smart and very unreadable essays about formalism and its implications. However, if there is one thing no one can avoid in their life, then it's the cold embrace of cruel death. And being outrun by some pretentious hipsters who think they own the world. And that is precisely what happened with formalism. Meet the modernists. If formalists tried to create some sort of logical system that could describe our relationship with art, then modernists existed with the sole purpose of shitting all over any systematic categorization of art, because they disregarded everything that was known about its most fundamental principles. They laughed at all of the rules that existed before them, constantly experimented with every single aspect of art creation, and praised self-expression above anything else. They did all that to spite people who tried to put creativity in some box of regulations and pedantic expectations. Of course, they caught a lot of bad press with such bold rejection of everything that came before them. People were furious that they diminished true art and that everything they create was unfit to be enjoyed by anyone who actually valued good art. Instead of putting art on an impossibly high pedestal one should aim for, they gave it back to people who were willing to experiment with established formulas and produce the most crazy and unique pieces as a result. Modernists saw any type of rules as limitations to the artist's ability to create anything genuine and fresh. And as a result of such revolution of new ideas and unexpected ways one can express themselves, art criteria became so brute that criticism of it became an almost impossible task. Because how do you even criticize something that intentionally rejects any established formulas and classifications? And more importantly, what do you even do after breaking into pieces everything that is known about art and its structure? I'll tell you what you do. You burn it all to the fucking ground. Remember at the very start of this video when you still thought that this TED Talk about history of art criticism was about Outer Wilds, I asked you a question. Many of you probably thought it was a rhetorical one, or that I was simply talking out of my ass to fill page space. And I was definitely doing all that, but at the same time there is an answer to this question. And it lies at the very heart of the last chapter of our journey. If formalists tried to find any meaning in how we value art, and modernists showed us that there is much more to art than just patterns and technique, then postmodernism is where it all finally ends. And it ends in a spectacular fire of chaos and individualism. It all ends in a world where everything is subjective, and art is the most subjective thing out of everything. No one can say what is and what is not art because everyone has their own vision of art. So who is really qualified enough to tell us that our own perception of art is incorrect? Can critics say that we are wrong for liking something that is not high class enough? Or maybe, just like the act of art creation is an ultimate expression of our freedom to create, the criticism of that art should also be about the freedom to express our inherently personal and subjective opinions about whatever you feel towards other creations. We do not live in isolation from all other parts of our culture. Everything around us influences how we see the world. Our unique life experiences is what dictates our vision of everything, even art. So instead of being too obsessed with trying to find the truth of this world, we should just sit down for a sec and finally state the obvious. Art is, and forever will be, in the eye of the beholder. The last lesson of postmodernism is that when we call something art, it becomes art, and there is not much you can do to stop that. Even a video game about world cosmonauts from a tiny planet rocket launching their spaceships straight into the sun because they haven't figured out the controls yet can be art if we simply say so, because it's not like the sun will explode just to stop us from doing so. Right?